So, how did we get to this point? I have been wrapping my head around that question since election night, and that was only 2 or 3 weeks ago, and it feels like a whole year has already passed by. I've been thinking, as a journalist who happens to be undocumented, I've been thinking about the media's role and how we got to this point, right? And when I say media, I don't just mean the legacy news organizations like the New York Times and the Washington Post. I also mean, of course, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. I mean the conservative media machine that has been used and has been weaponized these past few years, really for the past decade, right? I'm thinking a lot about politically how we got to this point, and politically what it means not only for, of course, for the Republicans, and Trump world and MAGA has made clear politically where the Republicans are, many Republicans are on this, but also how that has impacted where Democrats are on this, and where Vice President Kamala Harris, a daughter of immigrants, first generation American, where she ended up being on this issue. And then, of course, the question that has been animating everyone I know, everyone I know, and people that I've met in the past decade or so of doing this work is this question of what happens next? What is going to happen next? We're seeing that with the Trump appointments. We're seeing that with Stephen Miller. We're seeing that with the people that have been considered a part of this machine that was Project, 2025, that is now going to be at the White House. And this question of what would mass deportation really look like? I know from my end, it looks like an actual panic that this whole media machine talking about mass deportation has led to people wanting to self deport. I personally have heard from at least 11 people who have decided that this is just way too much and they're making a plan to leave, which is precisely the point of what's been happening. So today, we are going to speak to someone, very experienced person who's been doing this work in many different parts of the work for a while now, and she's somebody that I'm really looking forward to talking to. Andrea Flores is the Vice President of Immigration Policy at Forward.us. Previously, she worked for both the Biden and Obama administrations. Andrea, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the last time I saw you in person was actually on the very first day of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. I remember getting up early that morning because the venue wasn't that easy to get to. I got there, it was on the first day, and you were headlining. You were the main speaker at an event, and the title was The State of Immigration Reform. And in my head, I'm preparing for a full room. I mean, this is the issue that the Republicans and Donald Trump has staked his campaign on, and I just figured it was going to be a packed room. I get in there, I walk in, I see you. It was a mostly empty ballroom. I mean, how big was that ballroom, Andrea?
It was a huge ballroom, and they had set up a number of briefings on sort of top issues going into the election, but it was disappointing that there were so few people there to talk about this issue. But it also reflects that when the president and the presidential candidate were not prioritizing the issue, you could see how delegates didn't even attend what was coming next. And I think that was a missed opportunity. But I will talk to anyone about the state of immigration reform. And I really got a lot out of meeting Nebraska delegates, Wisconsin delegates, and hearing how hyper aware they were of what Washington wasn't addressing, whether that was their undocumented workforce in Wisconsin dairy farms, whether that was the lack of caregiving workers in Nebraska, who they feel like they can only fill those jobs with immigrants. You didn't hear any of those issues in this election from either party, but that's a reality of immigration for a lot of Americans today. And I think in this moment, we have to get back to how do Americans and their immigrant community members sort of live together, work together, experience different issues together. And, that was one of my takeaways. Was it reminded me that in Washington, we are having a very limited conversation about immigration right now. And it's about who's tough, who's not tough, who will close the border, who will open the border. It's extremely narrow. And that does a huge disservice to this issue.
So again, let me just back up a little bit, because here you were giving this very contextual, relevant, timely, urgent conversation, right? And the reality is there was as you said, there were some delegates there. I remember sitting next to a black woman, actually an educator from Chicago, who turned to me and said, "Why isn't anybody here?" And I want to ask you, like, what did you think of that moment and that kind of looking at that crowd? How was that a metaphor for the Democratic Party and where they are on this?
I think the Democratic Party leadership has been absent on immigration reform since President Biden took office, right? You didn't see a big push with he sent a day one bill to the Senate and the House. He never sent his team to try and get Republicans onto that bill. You didn't hear him mention signature issues like protecting DACA or, telling a story about how he was rebuilding the refugee program or the legal immigration program. There was essentially no explanation of the administration's immigration policies for 4 years. And when the campaign started, you still had Donald Trump had been selling the same policies and the same anti-immigrant rhetoric for 8 years. And it almost felt like that the party needed to engage with him only on his terms. And his terms were shutting down the border, being tough on asylum seekers, and restricting immigration. And so you saw really in this last year, in the absence of real leadership from Democratic leadership on the future of immigration reform, a huge shift to the right, because I understand that a lot of lawmakers felt that the only tools available were the ones that Trump was talking about. So it's really concerning that there isn't really necessarily a pro-immigrant party and an anti-immigrant party. I think there's a party that wants to restrict immigration and a party that hasn't yet settled on an agenda yet.
And as a follow-up, and this is something I've been wrapping my head around, why didn't Vice President Harris just completely differentiate from Trump and say, immigration is great. We are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants pay taxes. They make our economy work. You can have a whole argument about that. Why didn't that happen? And why didn't she and her campaign differentiate?
I think Biden's record on immigration, it was one of his most unpopular issues right next to inflation. And so I agree with you. Many of us who engaged with the campaign recommended that she contrast and that she needed to tell a completely different story than what the Biden administration had told, which they really told Americans no story on immigration, right? You had a huge number of people coming to the border to seek asylum. You saw Governor Greg Abbott sending immigrants into communities. You saw these tensions grow over 3 years. And by the time she stepped in, she really needed to answer to all of the Americans about really what they had seen from from Biden's first term. And I think that, Vice President Harris was responding to this idea that immigration is just toxic for Democrats. And that isn't the case. It wasn't that President Biden tried a number of pro-immigrant policies and the country rejected them. It's that there was really no policy vision offered on this issue. And so when people saw problems at the border or problems in cities, they were going to go to the party that was providing solutions, even if those solutions, I would say that Democrats have better answers on a lot of these issues. So I think Harris was listening to people who think that immigration is a loser. And yet you have the Federal Reserve Chair in his updates every single time he gives an update is talking about how our economy is strong because of increased immigration. There's a huge disconnect between how we're benefiting as a nation from immigration and how the Democratic leadership has been talking about it, and Republican leadership.
And is so much of this, Andrea, a messaging issue? Like, it seems as if Republicans, particularly Trump world, has been running the table on what we talk about when it comes to immigration. And is that because of the media machine that has amplified all of that?
I think it's very easy for the media machine to amplify images of chaos and disorder wherever they are, right? And so I remember when I started in the Biden White House, it was the National Security Council, I tried to set a goal, which is that all of our systems should lead to what we call street releases, right? We should be transporting people from end to end, helping them go through a process, helping them know their rights when it comes to the border. And what you saw, instead of building out what we had planned to build out, it was an embrace of Trump policy, not just messaging, Trump policies. So Biden kept a policy that was the most extreme sort of suspension of asylum law we had seen. And when we got into the White House, we saw that actually it was causing smugglers to charge people 5-6 times to try and cross the border. That policy was not actually a better policy for, say, a more secure border or a more orderly border. But there was a fear that getting rid of a Trump policy would be seen as soft on the issue or politically too reactive or giving into progressives or the groups. That was just a bad operational policy, right? So that's an example where it's not just that the messaging is it's not just a messaging issue, it's also a policy choice. So if we're choosing also Trump's policies, but we're trying to do them and sell them differently, that's not going to work. Why wouldn't then a voter just pick Trump to execute his own policies?
I have to say, by the way, I mean, you have a very interesting relationship with the Biden administration. You worked for the administration and resigned. Can you talk about the reasons behind that resignation?
Yeah, of course. So when I've been a policy staffer most of my career. And when you serve a principal, a president, you need to, your name is not on the door. You're not the one elected. And you need to be able to deliver and implement the policy vision. But I was so concerned. What I was seeing was that there was no vision there were no solutions at the border. There was not going to be a push in Congress for immigration reform. They were looking at policies that Democrats had uniformly criticized under Trump, one, because they were cruel, but two, because they had caused major operational chaos, put children, families in detention facilities that were just completely inhumane. And so I felt that we had lost sight of the work we were trying to do. And then when the Del Rio crisis happened.
This morning, as massive crowds of people living in this makeshift migrant camp beneath a Texas border bridge slowly starts to thin, new questions about the response by authorities.
The response was what it was. You have to ask yourself, can I serve this president well and execute these policies? I didn't believe that we had an agenda that was going to solve the problems that we were seeing that whole first year.
And I'm curious, so coming from the administration, can you talk, because I just want to make sure for anybody watching and listening who's not familiar with it, how would you explain the role of Forward That Us as an organization and what brought you to Forward That Us?
Sure. So when I'd served in government and felt that I had, could have impact for many years, whether that was doing defensive work and trying to prevent bad policies from becoming law or trying to push and implement policies like DACA. And when I no longer felt that there wasn't the political space to move on immigration reform, and I wanted to join an organization on the outside to help build that political space back up, right? And the Overton window was shifting to the right. And so I joined Forward.us. It's a bipartisan organization. We do work nationally. And I wanted to try and offer a more affirmative policy vision for lawmakers on this issue, right? So explain to them again, get back in the room and sit down with them and say, I know the politics are bad, but here are some affirmative solutions. It is better for all American communities, for the working class, for immigrants themselves to legalize a long time undocumented. It is better to have an orderly border by not having everyone feel that their only choice is to come up through the asylum system. And to I wanted to offer solutions. The US has the largest undocumented population in the entire world. That's a crazy fact that I don't think a lot of people realize. And the reason that population has grown is because lawmakers have done nothing in my lifetime to solve that problem. All right. And I call it a problem because we have people living and working like yourself who have been a part of this country and contribute immensely. And we've offered no legal way for you to benefit from the security of not being, fearful of deportation, legal work authorization, all of these things. And what you hear from communities over and over again is they're very aware of the immigrants who live and work among them, and they want them to be protected, and they don't want to see them torn away. But when you don't have policymakers, I'm sure as a journalist, what has been the answer to our immigration problems for 20 years? It's been a promise for comprehensive immigration reform. What does that even mean anymore? And I want to get back to, and being it forward, we have no expectation that someone's going to pass a big immigration bill anytime soon. But we do know that even during, the height of when Mayor Eric Adams in New York was complaining about, the number of immigrants coming in, what I saw also was the mayor of Erie, Pennsylvania, making calls and doing interviews saying, we want immigrants here in our community. And, the mayor of Pittsburgh saying, we want immigrants here in our community. So I see all these areas of potential hope for the issue, but we have to meet the moment and be like, how do we help increase immigration to, sort of rural American communities? That's an American good, and it's good for immigrants too. And how do we allow employers to sponsor perhaps their longtime undocumented workers? Why would we want those employers to lose that workforce that they've trained and hired? Why do we want universities to have to, kick out students that they've accepted and that are contributing? I think most communities don't want that. And I don't think that's what this election was about. This election was not about mass deportation. This election was about rebuking the fact that Biden governed on this issue very poorly, and people did not like what they saw, and they were not hearing a coherent policy or messaging answer on what was coming next.
And mind you, I just really want to underscore the fact that you shared and stated very clearly just a few moments ago. The United States has the largest undocumented population in the world. And right now, there is no solution whatsoever on the table to address the complexity of that statement.
That's absolutely right. And if you ask why I'm at an organization like Forward.us, is that we have to work together with other immigrant rights orgs, but also beyond that, we have to work together with states and with cities and build up the political pressure on both parties to start talking about the solution to that again. Because even under Biden, there were some very smart policy innovations that Biden did. And one of them was about changing the way even new arrivals entered and giving them work authorization. And while that just highlighted the unfairness for people who'd been here and couldn't get work authorization, it also showed that you could design a better system where people don't have to come into the country and be immediately trapped and unable to work and not have the support of, say, a sponsor. The way that he expanded the opportunities for Americans to sponsor new arrivals was really brilliant. And that's a good example of a story that the administration never told. They never highlighted the fact that over 1 million Americans were not just sponsoring people from countries like Ukraine and Afghanistan, but were also sponsoring new arrivals from places like Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela. And they were raising their hands and they said they wanted to do this. So I think there are ways to make Americans part of the infrastructure of our immigration system again, but we have to lift up and explain why those policies are good for our communities, good for immigrants. And so that's where I see the role. Trump 2.0 will not look like Trump 1.0, because in Trump 1.0, there was so much harm done that the public swung massively in the support of sort of immigrants' rights. And that's why you saw Biden take the approach that he did on his campaign. But you could see how quickly that support was lost when it wasn't met with an affirmative policy vision. So I really think the work right now is explaining to Americans what they have to benefit from fixing our immigration system, because they have a great deal to benefit from this. And we can only just look to other countries that have delayed similarly reforming their immigration systems, and they are desperate for immigrants to come. And we are so lucky that people still want to come here, and that we are lucky that people want to come here, work, and they also want to go home, which our system makes it incredibly difficult for people to leave if they want to. It sets up all the wrong incentives. And I think these are all conversations that, either party can start having, but that need to be had.
I was raising my hand when you said it makes it really difficult, right? So I've been here 31 years and I have to keep telling people if I leave, there's no guarantee I'll be allowed back, and I would face what's called a 10-year bar, which happened under the Clinton administration. So both parties have been responsible for, in many ways, as you were talking about the Biden administration and what it's tried to do, there's a lot of sweeping under the rug and not dealing with kind of what's in front of us, and also not, as you were saying, it's almost as if we don't want to talk about what we're actually doing. Why is that? How would you characterize the Biden administration's positioning on this issue? Is it something that they just want to sweep it under the rug? Was it how would you describe it?
I mean, my interpretation was that they were highly risk averse on this issue and felt that there were likely not to be any wins by being, heavily pro-immigrant, and that they would only get criticism for problems. But I also think their positioning just reflected a discomfort with the issue, right? As you said, Vice President Harris, even in her one immigration speech that she gave in Arizona, was a far more kind of comprehensive personal, clear vision. I actually really, even if I didn't agree with every piece of policy she talked about, she actually got back to saying, like, we need to build modern legal pathways for people to come here. We need to help the long time undocumented and help them come forward and give them a process. And we need to secure the border. It was at least a more robust, I had never heard that from the Biden administration, right? You can't think of a speech he gave where he kind of gave the full arc of what he was trying to do by, even if he had just been highlighting the fact that he prioritized rebuilding the refugee program, which he did, right? They got that program completely functioning again and hitting the mark of their goal of resettling X number of refugees in this year. That's a huge win. And it's something that has historically been popular with both parties. But once again, I just think it was a discomfort with the issue. I feel like once it became such a low approval issue, I just sensed in my own experience advocating, whether it was inside from the Senate or forward, that they were not convinced that any of these solutions were going to win them new political support.
Just before the election, you wrote an article in Foreign Affairs titled "Why Washington Has Failed to Solve the Border Crisis. Fixing asylum matters, but not as much as creating new pathways for legal immigration." Can you tell us more about the article?
I like to explain that our immigration system at its best is it's meant to connect immigrants with employers and support our economy. It's meant to allow families to come here, bring their family members, keep families together. And then it's also meant to provide refuge to people fleeing persecution, torture, or extraordinary conditions in their countries of origin. And the asylum system is this, I think it represents the best of who we could be as a nation, is that, it comes from the post-World War II order. It says we will never again turn away people where they will, experience death, harm. And, it's never necessarily, though, worked up to its full potential. And so you saw when it started in the 80s, based on different sort of political equities, you saw El Salvadorans be turned away when they were facing a civil war. You saw Central Americans be turned away. And so I wouldn't ever say the asylum system has functioned as well as it could function. But what has happened is that the last time Congress increased visas in a significant way was in 1990. Mm-hmm. And so when you saw displacement rise in the Western Hemisphere, you saw an immense need for whether people traveling for work or family, for them to relocate. And the U.S. immigration system offered no legal pathways for them to do so. And when the crisis got so bad, it really starts around 2014 when families from Central America with very strong asylum claims started coming to our border. They faced a system that had never been designed to adjudicate or to receive that many claims. And so there was an immediate sort of breakdown of a system, and not because people were seeking asylum, but because the system is designed by lawmakers hadn't sort of been thought through operationally to actually do that task. And so one of the arguments I make in the Foreign Affairs article is both parties for the last 10 years have tried to convince themselves that if we just eliminate asylum or make it harder to access or turn people away, that the modern day border crisis as we know it will just go away. But people always migrate to borders, right? There will always be someone at the border. You're never going to get down to zero. And if that's how we define success as a nation, we will always lose. And it's why it's been a failure from both parties. And they both tried very similar tactics. And so where I want to move and what I argue in this article is that let's make asylum functional and operate for the people who end up coming to the border, but let's also make it what it was always supposed to be, an emergency relief mechanism for someone absolutely in need to flee. And so it is not supposed to be for people who are coming to work or seek family reunification, and that's okay. But we have to offer those displaced people options too. And we need to offer them temporary options where they can come and see family without having to cross the border. We can also offer them more resettlement options because the U.S. is in population decline and we can benefit from it. But to me, we have to totally rethink as a nation and with both parties, what does a secure border mean? To me, it means a functioning asylum system, and it means far fewer immigrants having to access our immigration system through a human smuggling network. So the key to that, though, is getting lawmakers to remember they get to create visas. They get to help industries. They get to respond to Republican governors who say, I want to sponsor an immigrant. I want to raise my hand and ask for this many visas for my state. That is what they need to be doing. And if they just keep eliminating asylum and turning it back on and turning it back off, we're going to be stuck as a nation. And we're always going to see fluctuating numbers that have so many times there could be a really bad storm in the region and we could have a border crisis, right? And then we have a meltdown. That isn't about asylum. That's about our like emergency management systems. And so getting it right, once again, getting the policy right and stop pretending that this is just about people on the left want asylum, people on the right don't. No, it's about making all the legal pathways work together so that way the emergency measures are there for people who are in an emergency.
Now, having heard all that, here's the reality. We are weeks away from the next Trump administration, right? He's announced that Tom Homan, his former acting ICE director, will be the border czar. And he said he's ready to carry out Trump's promise of mass deportation on day one. And the media strategy around this has just been so enormous, from the Filipino community, of which I'm a part of, to Latino community, to Chinese immigrants. Like, this has been very much out there, right? What do you think an effort to carry out mass deportation will look like?
So first, I want to recognize how just horrific it is that people are so scared,
Yes.
that the media is trying to predict what will happen. I think that's really dangerous for a lot of people because we don't exactly know how they will do this. And people have rights and they're on different statuses. And so I think the entire approach by the media is also missing the fact that Biden can do things right now to at least slow and minimize some of the harm that's to come. And there's been almost no focus on that question. And so that is one thing, whether it's using tools that are very, that are difficult to sort of eliminate, the tools like TPS. There's not that many, but there are some. And, making sure that people who are not in priority enforcement have their removal cases closed. Like, there are steps every single day is a day that they could be reducing some of this harm or mass deportation. So that's one thing that the media should be pressing them on and asking about. But what it could look like, it depends on their approach. So it will take time, right? They have to get into office. They have to assess, are they going to start with people with final orders of removal? Are they going to need new detention contracts? They will almost certainly need new space to detain people. And that will take some time. But they also have a very large federal sort of law enforcement workforce within DHS alone. And because Biden has essentially shut down a lot of the asylum processing at the border, they can also pull officers off the border and send them into communities and start arresting people in much higher numbers. So I think what we can accurately say, at least right now, is you will see an increase of ICE and Border Patrol presence in communities arresting people. And I think people have to remember to carry their identification documents, their work authorization cards. Community members, groups, mayors need to be on alert. People should be right now going to their city council, to their county governments and saying, we do not actually support these types of removals, but they could increase arrests very quickly and increase sort of detention very quickly, especially if they're using like the land that Texas has offered. So the media should be educating people, but they shouldn't be scaring people by not including facts that the military has been used in immigration enforcement before, like kind of like calmly assessing what they're saying. Because right now I think they are trying to be as sensational as possible. They are trying to be as scary as possible. And people will have a little bit of time, and state and local lawmakers have steps they can take. And like I said, President Biden has some time to like make it so they can't immediately on day one do as much harm as they'd like to.
Now, I have to ask you this question. I know a lot of folks out there are feeling pessimistic. I know this because I hear it from everybody. What do you say to that? What do you say? How would you address not only the panic, but the pessimism that has really permeated so much of the conversation about what's going to happen?
I understand it. And, I wouldn't be in this work if I didn't have immense just concern for the limbo that people have been in for so many years. And I have very little patience for policymakers who aren't fighting for these members of their community, who have been members of their community for, it's just been a fabric of who we are as a nation. And so I say, I understand it. And also, I firmly believe that the American people, when they see what mass deportations could be, are going to have a very bad reaction to it. And they're going to realize, wait, this isn't also what we wanted in the immigration space. And if we do not have community leaders, organizers, hopefully members of Congress saying this is what should happen instead, that is what I want to be pushing people to be lifting up, because I worry that people take away from this election that being pro-immigrant or advocating for reform or attending, a DNC conversation on the future of immigration reform is politically bad for the Democratic Party, for example. We have to move away from that, because I understand why people are cynical, but we need a lot more diverse stakeholders fighting for them, to give them the space that they need to do to protect themselves. Like, I'm an American citizen and the daughter of an undocumented immigrant, a granddaughter of the undocumented immigrant. And I feel like it is part of my job as an American to fight for the immigrants who I don't necessarily want them to put their lives on the line again for another Trump term. But I think there are going to be people fighting again when they start to see what Tom Homan really means when he says, I won't separate families. I'll deport entire families together, including U.S. citizens. That is not going to go well for President Trump. And I think that is an opportunity to remind everybody as to what they have to benefit from reforming our immigration system.
As one of the features, by the way, of our episodes is we're taking questions from audiences, and people have been sending these questions on Instagram, on Facebook, on email. So thank you for sending these questions. I'm going to ask you two, Andrea, given your expertise. The first one, are undocumented Americans, and I love that framing, are undocumented Americans safe in sanctuary states? And what are even sanctuary states and localities, if you can even define that?
Sure. So, the far right wants you to believe that a sanctuary state has no rule of law and is harboring people who've committed very, very violent crimes, or some version of the scariest image they can create. But really, a sanctuary state is a community or state or city that has decided it is actually not good for public safety. It is not good for their own security to have state and local law enforcement be trying to enforce immigration laws for the federal government. And that, in fact, they would rather pass policies that give immigrants IDs, that allow them to use, go to the library, allow them to integrate, which is a very important piece of immigration reform we don't talk about enough. And so, is someone safe in a sanctuary community? It depends on the laws that are in place in your individual community. But, if you're in California, if you're in New York, you have far better sort of protections in a state like that. If you're in Texas or if you're in Florida, I would advise people to consider not staying in those states, because not only are there not agreements that state and local law enforcement should not be, redirecting their resources to attempt to racially profile and find out who's an immigrant. But also, I just don't trust that those systems are going to be able to protect their very, very large and documented communities living and working there. So I think we do have to get really practical about that and say you are far better off being in a state like Illinois than you are going to be in a state like Florida right now. And I don't want to. And it's not perfect, right? You've heard Homan already say, we'll cut funding. We're going to use coercive tactics to get sanctuary states and cities to allow ICE to come in. But I'd rather anyone potentially impacted be in a city where their mayor or governor is going to fight that than not.
The other question, the last question I want to ask you, and this is, I think, a really important one. Other than the southern border, what other immigrant communities need more attention and activism?
I mean, I feel like this moment is a reset for the movement in a lot of ways, because it is an opportunity for us to move away from how anti-immigrant sort of leaders want us to think, which is that it's like new arrivals versus a long time undocumented, or TPS holders versus DACA recipients. I reject that. We have a diverse undocumented population, a diverse illegal immigrant population, many individual statuses. And at the end of the day, until communities in all 50 states understand how they have benefited from that fact and understand how it is better for them if people have a secure status, if people can travel home to see their family without being trapped out of the country, if people can, access English language learning services, if people can integrate, if they don't understand how that makes us a stronger nation, then we'll continue to be in this space where all these different immigrant groups are pitted against each other. But I will also continue to say, and I said this throughout the Biden administration, it was extremely concerning to me that we lost sight, and I'll say we, from my past work in Democratic politics, that we lost sight of the long time undocumented, because that is a population that has been sort of, the most harmed for so long, and yet is the most integrated in our community. So continuing to tell this story, I don't think most Americans know that we have the largest undocumented population in the world. I don't think they know that if you're undocumented and you marry a U.S. citizen, it doesn't necessarily mean you can, access a path to citizenship. I think people are really misinformed about what having a temporary status is like. And to me, it's an all of the above approach. And I think we all can't do everything, right? Forward.us can't advocate on every single issue on immigration, but we do have to go to communities that have benefited immensely. I think about Springfield, Ohio. I think about Portland, Maine. Communities that have opened up their doors, increased immigration because they wanted to, needed to, and benefited from it. I want to start hearing those stories coming out. I don't just want the next 4 years to be about the latest cruel thing Trump did. Yes, there should be responses to that and people need to be defended, but we have to be lifting up the benefits, or else I'm very concerned we'll move into a fully restrictionist society for immigrants, and that will serve nobody. I didn't talk much about the economy, but just an economic issue alone, the whole country will suffer from that approach. And for me, the work of the next 4 years is to find every single community and talk about the benefits of immigration reform. And I think that's why your show is so important too.
Well, Andrea, thank you so much for that kind of truth telling. And that's actually what we are anchoring this show on, is how do we tell all these truths that in some ways we have tucked, hidden, not centralized. So thank you for that. We are ending every episode actually with some sort of words, either from a book or a poem written by an immigrant writer, and also from some of the messages that I've been getting for the past 13 years. And it's actually, listening to you, it makes it even more appropriate that I'm reading this message. I got this email 10 years ago. The email says, "Hello, Jose. I have been here for 25 years, and I really want to know more of my country. I want to visit New York, Las Vegas, Orlando, Hollywood, etc., etc. But I'm afraid to go to the airport because I don't have documents. I follow you on Twitter, and I always wondered, how do you do it? I hope one day we could fix our situation and I can know my country."
Yeah.
I hope one day we could fix our situation and I can know my country. And you know what the subject line of the email was?
What was it?
Flying.
Well, it's a perfect way to end this, because whether it was you telling your story when you did, and everyone who has risked so much, we can't let the fact that an anti-immigrant president was elected discourage us from doing what's right from all of these people who have not yet experienced the country that they've been in. And that was the inspiration I personally needed.
So thank you for your work. Thank you for the writer who wrote that. And I think about it every time I fly. And I hope for all of us who are undocumented that we will do everything we can so we can fly. Thank you.
Thank you.